Thank you all for being here. I'm Lynn Sylvan, Executive Director of the Eugene Veg Education Network. I see a lot of familiar faces out there and a lot of new faces, so thank you all. In the lobby, there's a table with various literature on it. It's all free, help yourself, magazines, recipes, DVDs, whatever you want, it's all yours. If you want to receive our newsletter and recipes and nutritional information and magazines and whatever else we offer, just put your name on the free subscribe list. Also, if you could silence your phones during this presentation, that would be very much appreciated also. And I want to thank our volunteers for being here. We couldn't do anything without you guys. Really, we're so grateful for you. Thank you. This will be a day to remember for you. This is one of the best nutrition info lectures you will ever hear, guaranteed. We're honored to have Janice Stanger, PhD, author of the Perfect Formula Diet, who is an educator and nutrition expert. This is her book, The Perfect Formula Diet. She specializes in busting common myths about food, health, and aging, and in presenting science-based information in a way that's clear and understandable. She enjoys sharing information to help people, our planet, and the animals. Janice has spent 28 years critically analyzing plant-based nutrition research. She's certified in plant-based nutrition through the T. Colin Campbell Foundation. Janice has an MBA from the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD is in human development and aging from the University of California, San Francisco, which is a leading health sciences campus. Would you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Janice Stanger.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out this gorgeous spring afternoon, coming out the sunshine for an hour. Hopefully I can give you some excellent information and you can get back out in the sunshine again or run the marathon tomorrow or whatever you're busy doing. So you can see from the title how ambitious this presentation is. It kind of looks to mix and match and balance all three of the macronutrients in food that you always hear about. And the primary story here, though, is a little different from anything you probably ever heard before because it looks at it from the perspective of your body, how your body works, how your body functions, and therefore, when you understand your body, it will be much easier for you to decide what to eat. Okay, and then in the end, I'm going to pull everything together in an easy-to-remember summary, very easy-to-remember summary. But before I do that, in order for you to understand it, because if I just gave you the easy-to-remember summary right now, you'd walk off kind of shrugging your shoulders and probably not even understanding what I'm talking about. But once we go through the science, it'll make total intuitive sense to you, and you'll remember it. So first, we do need to go through the science, and for each of these macronutrients, there's a science that probably most of you, unless you're biochemists or physiologists or something, have probably never heard from before. But they look at all this, and then when you look at it from that perspective, as I said, it becomes much easier. So let's get going on doing that. So the first thing you might be wondering is why don't I do what everybody else does, which is just to tell you what to eat, to stand up here and say, this is good, this is bad, basically because I say so, or because I pull up one study that was done 50 years ago among some obscure, region of the world. And you just have to take my word for it. But I don't want to do that. And the thing about understanding your body is that it's kind of like if you're floating on a raft and you're having a really good time, but then you fall off the raft and you remember you don't know how to swim, that's not such a good feeling. And it's the same thing with nutrition, because actually when you go out there and probably within an hour, if not even less, of the time you leave this room, you're going to hear somebody else or see somebody else or run across a headline somewhere that tells you something very different from what I'm telling you. And unless you understand your body, you're not necessarily going to understand how to evaluate it. And the thing is, with just some simple information that you definitely don't need a PhD for, you can learn to evaluate it and see what is consistent with the laws of chemistry, biology, and physics, which is always a good thing because we know, nature's out there and cheap bats last. So another thing I want to mention is this is just a general education presentation. So if you have a specific clinical condition or a specific medical issue that applies just to you, then please ask your medical professional. Other than that, if you have, when I get through this at the end, if you have general educational questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. But please hold them till the end because we've got really a lot to get through. So one of the first misconceptions I want to address, and this is a more general one, it's not, one specific to the 3 macronutrients or micronutrients or anything else, is a misconception that's out there that pretty much rules most thoughts about nutrition, is the idea that if a little of something is good, then more is better. But the truth is that if a little of something is good, then more is probably toxic excess. And so why do I say that? And the answer is your body's always trying to survive, like your body's programmed for survival. Your body is a product of 4 billion years of evolution just on this planet. So we're all survivors. And so your body is trying to do what it needs to do to stay alive. And in order to do this, it's got to take care of each of its cells. Now, depending on what expert you listen to, you've got something between 37 trillion and 100 trillion cells in your body. And that doesn't include your microbiome, that's just your own cells. So, they're all having to balance their needs every second. And in addition to balancing their own needs, they're having to coordinate with all the cells around it and every cell everywhere in the body. So if you think of the amount of brain power that would be necessary to do that, you can see it's going to pretty much eclipse anything that we have consciously available to us. So we have to make sure we're kind of getting out of our body's way so it can do this job of balancing everything and maintaining this stable state called homeostasis, where everything in the body, both within cells and between cells and in organs and everything else, is maintained in a very narrow survivable range of things like the amount of oxygen in your blood and the amount of iron in your blood and the amount of glucose and everything else you can think of, acidity versus alkalinity. People always think more is better, but in fact you survive in the most minutely narrow range. And if you get out of that in terms of temperature, really almost anything else you can think of, it's not survivable for you. So when we take our bodies and we dump too much on them, it's at least as bad, if not in some ways worse, than giving them too little, because your bodies have learned over billions of years of evolution to sometimes how to make do or fill in with something when it doesn't have enough. But when it gets toxic excess, that is sometimes very hard to cope with. So you don't want to muck up this fantastically intricate system that you have. So that said, let's get started on the specific macronutrient myths. Now, of course, there's endless myths about each of these macronutrients, so I'm just going to talk about kind of one per macronutrient, but that should be enough to get you started. So the dangerous misconception we're going to talk about on protein is the idea that the proteins in your food are the proteins in your body, and thus you better have plenty of them. Like the more protein, the better, right? Aren't we out there buying billions of dollars worth of protein powders every year and stocking up on everything and picking foods because they're high protein and everything like that? So let's drill down on that. Let me give you an example of the specific myth I'm talking about. It's the idea that, for example, in order to build muscle, you have to eat muscle. So you eat animal muscle because you think that's going to build your own muscle, or you eat animal collagen because you think that's going to build your own collagen, and so on. So we're going to have to work our way down for each of these. A few levels, we'll just gradually kind of descend till we get to the fundamental truth. And from there, we can, move on to see why it's interesting. And in this particular example, I'm going to use collagen as an example only because everybody's heard of it and has seen bone broth, 100 different brands of it, very overpriced pretty much anywhere they shop. So it seemed to me that was a good example to just kind of work with. But it doesn't exclude all the other kinds of protein that are out there either. So collagens are proteins that take the form of fibers, and they're connective tissues, structural tissues in your body. Things like your skin, your bones, your tendons, and those kind of things are all made from different kinds of collagen. You can see pictures there because they generally take the form of fibers. This is a picture from the National Institutes of Health of a particular kind of collagen. So collagen is one class of proteins, as I said, and so we need to get to the question of what a protein is to kind of work our way down to the fundamental level where we can draw conclusions we're comfortable with. So first off, proteins are linked chains of amino acids, and this is really important to understand. It's probably the single most important thing to understand about protein is that proteins are linked chains of amino acids. There's 20 kinds of amino acids that form all living beings, which includes all animals and all plants, etc. And the study of proteins is basically a science called proteomics, which has been around for a while, but of course it gets more and more intricate all the time. And most people haven't heard of it, but they'll do very detailed and, in the minds of a layperson, kind of an obscure studies of what proteins are and their roles in the body. So just as you're sitting here today, you might have as many as 2 million kinds of protein chains sitting in your body, just where you're sitting in the chair breathing. That's how many there are. And when you think about how many kinds of protein chains you could put together with these 20 amino acids, and thinking there could be as few as a dozen or two amino acids in a chain, but there could be 10,000 or more. So when you think of the length of these chains and the fact that if you just interchange one of these 20 amino acids in a chain of 10,000, you have a completely different substance. And the fact that chain also must be correctly folded to work, because if it's not folded, it doesn't matter if you got 10,000 amino acids in just the right sequence, it's not going to have any biological activity. So it's got to be the perfect sequence. Everything's got to be right about it, including how it's folded, to be biologically active. And the thing about the 20 kinds of amino acids is plants build all these 20 kinds of amino acids. Plants are amino acid factories, or the amino acid factories of planet Earth. And bacteria build them all too, because bacteria have to be able to do that because they can't eat plants. But those of us who eat plants instead of bacteria are going to get all our essential amino acids from plants. Why? Because animals can't make essential amino acids. It takes a huge amount of metabolic energy to make it. You got your plants are happy, they're sitting out in the sun, they've got, solar power, they can make whatever they want. But, those of us who are animals, we have a constrained metabolism and we're limited to how much food we can get. And so we've kind of lost the ability to make these essential amino acids because we can get them all from plants. So the essential amino acids are the ones you have to consume because your body can't make them. The non-essential amino acids you don't have to worry about because your body makes them. The essential ones only come from plants. So just remember that next time you're worried about essential amino acids, is that they come originally from a plant you ate, or they might come from an animal that ate a plant, or they might come from an animal that ate an animal that ate a plant, but they all kind of go back to plants. And that's a very important point in figuring out what we're going to be talking about. So what happens when you eat proteins? It's pretty simple. You have to break down the chain. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, this is very inefficient. I mean, I have all these proteins and, I just ate a whole bunch in a meal, so why does my body have to go to all the work in my stomach and intestines of breaking the chain down into the amino acids and just absorbing the amino acids and not the protein? Well, the answer is because you can't use the protein of another being, whether that protein is from a black bean, or a leaf of kale, or whether it's from a cow. It doesn't matter. You can't eat it. You can eat it, but you can't use it because you have your own genetic material. And your body can only go with the genetics of proteins that you build. So the only way your body can build its own protein is to break down the protein you eat into amino acids and uses its DNA and other cellular machinery to make the amino acids that it needs. The proteins that it needs by stringing together all these amino acids. So this is a basic process. So every being on Earth, unless you have an identical twin or you're a clone, is going to have its own proteins and therefore needs to go through this process of breaking down amino acids. So why is this misconception about, eating the proteins that you need to form the proteins in your body so dangerous? The idea that, if you don't eat animal muscle, you can't build muscle, or if you don't drink bone broth, you can't make collagen. Why is that dangerous? We can see now that it's silly and it has absolutely nothing to do with the laws of nature or evolution or anything else. But why would that make it dangerous? And there's kind of two answers to that. And that'll be true. I'm not going to go into all these myths, but it's kind of true of all of them. One is that it leads you to make unwise action. For example, in the case of food, believing this myth might make you want to eat a lot of animal foods rather than plant foods, and that is really not a good thing. Because there's a million studies out there, and this would be a completely different presentation, but there's a million studies out there that show that the eating more animal foods is more dangerous than eating more plant foods. So you want to eat plant foods and not animal foods. So that's one reason. But the other reason I think is almost more important is this sense of complacency. So complacency is the idea that you know things, you understand things, therefore you can stop learning, you can start questioning. Because ever since you were in grade school and you listened to your mom and your dad and your doctor and, media pundits and all these other people, they've told you, if you don't eat muscle, you're never going to grow muscle. And, you have to go out and eat steaks or you're never going to be a weightlifter and all this kind of stuff. So by now you're really complacent, even though you really don't understand any of the basic facts of biology when you believe that. And so that keeps you from going out and questioning and learning things. When you realize there's all these myths out there, then your mind can be open. You can go out and you can learn new facts. You can listen to people. You can, read things that are scientifically valid. You can go to textbooks and science journals, and that's what I advise, is going to science journals or textbooks, not, Joey's blog on the internet, or just some person who's writing a book because they think they're going to sell you a lot of supplements. And so, I really think complacency is the enemy of solving almost any problem you can name, and that's another reason these misconceptions are dangerous. So there's a huge amount more that could be said about protein, but in the interest of times, now we're going to go on to the next macronutrient I promised to let you have some information about. And that's carbohydrates. And again, there's a zillion myths out there, but the one I'm going to talk about today, the dangerous misconception, is that your body uses carbohydrates for nothing but fuel. And even for that purpose, they aren't really needed. Don't you hear that every day, especially from keto people, that, you don't even need carbs for energy. That's all they're good for, but you can just burn fat, so why even bother with them? So, one thing we can say about carbohydrates is they get no respect. Like protein gets all the respect, fat gets maybe a tiny little corner of the respect, and carbohydrates get no respect. But I'm hoping like 10 minutes from now, you'll realize that that's kind of backward. So the first thing is, even though I'm focusing this talk on macronutrients, it's because that's what everybody hears about every day. You can't probably spend a day where you go online or talk to somebody or read something. You don't hear something about some macronutrient, right? But we'll see when we get to the end and we do our little summary that the macronutrients don't really even matter. It's just what you hear a lot about. And you eat food, you don't really even eat macronutrients. You decide what food to eat. So, for example, lentils aren't the same as lollipops, and carrots aren't the same as cookies. And I don't want to reinforce the idea that all carbs are alike or all proteins are alike or whatever. So, saying that all carb-rich foods are alike because they contain a lot of calories and carbohydrates is like saying all books are alike because they're all printed on paper. I mean, it's just a completely ridiculous idea. So we're going to go on to our next science, and I hope you find this exciting because I can tell you that the scientists in this field, over the years, I've been doing this research for almost 3 decades now, as Lynn let you know. I've read, tens of thousands of research articles and I don't know how many textbooks, and, scientists get excited about their work, but I've never anywhere read any scientists that are more excited about their work than glycobiologists. Well, you've never probably heard of glycobiology before, so you might be wondering, who are these glycobiologists and why are they jumping up and down every day they get to go to work? Well, it's a relatively recent science, and it looks at the structure, biology, synthesis, and roles of carbohydrates, which people in glycobiology call carbohydrates glycans just because, scientists like to use jargon, so they think they'll confuse the rest of us. And I want to be kind of faithful to the science, so I'm going to use the word glycans too. But every time I say glycans, what I want to hear kind of go off in your own mind is carbohydrate. So glycans are also called, as I said, saccharides, carbohydrates, sugar chains. There's other things they're called. It's a relatively recent science. It's very fast expanding. They have their own textbooks. They have their own journals. And one reason it's so recent is carbohydrates are actually much harder to study than proteins are because they take a lot more forms and they evolve much more rapidly, and their roles in the body aren't as well understood. So simple sugars, which is what glycans are made of, are like single unit sugars, and those are called monosaccharides, and then they go up to what can be vast assemblages of these simple sugars called polysaccharides. And those can be, just like protein chains, they can be fairly short or they can range up to thousands of units. And protein chains pretty much only take the form of chains and then they get folded in a certain way. But the glycan chains are much more complicated because they can be built in many different ways. So for example, these glycan chains can be straight, which protein chains are more or less before they're folded. They can be branched, they can form rings, and they're also always evolving and changing. So in order to study them, you have to be much more kind of on your toes. And the chemical and biological properties of these glycans is going to vary a lot depending on the role in your body and a lot of other things going on in your body at the time you're consuming them or using them. Okay, so another thing about these glycans is sometimes they work in isolation, and they might just have some carbohydrate unit that's forming some indispensable function in isolation. And by indispensable, I don't mean just supplying energy, because supplying energy is indispensable, but I mean indispensable things in addition to supplying energy, which is what I'm going to be talking about when I'm talking about these glycans. So in order to accomplish what they need to accomplish, often they bind to other kinds of molecules that form the other macronutrients. So they might bind to fats or other lipids, fats being kind of lipids, and we'll talk about them soon. And in that case, they're called glycolipids, or they very often bond to different proteins, in which case they're called glycoproteins. And so those are the forms they often take when they're having a critical role to play in your body. And the glycobiologists often compare carbohydrates to the dark matter, the biological universe. You've probably all heard of dark matter out in cosmos. We don't know what it is, but we know it's there and we know it's important. And a lot of what's true about carbohydrates in your body is not really understood any more than dark matter is understood, but we just know it's really important. But scientists are understanding more all the time and learning to appreciate it. So as I said, these carbohydrates have different roles. They're absolutely critical to the structure and functioning of your body and have been throughout evolution. So let's see. Here's one quote from one of those enthusiastic glycobiologists, and if you start reading their stuff, which is worth reading just to bring a smile to your face because these guys are so into what they do, you'll read lots of quotes like this one. This one's pretty easy to understand. So the scientist says, complex and diverse glycans appear to be ubiquitous to all cells in nature and essential to all life forms. Thus, more than 3 billion years of evolution consistently generated organisms that use these molecules for many key biological roles. In this respect, glycans are no different from other major macromolecular building blocks of life, which includes nucleic acids, which is your genes, proteins, and lipids, simply more rapidly evolving and complex. So you can see this is not something that just humans have or just mammals have. It's pretty much true in plants and bacteria, in mammals and reptiles. It's true in pretty much whatever is alive on Earth, is they have these various glycoconjugates, and they're very important for the functioning of the organism. Now, obviously, not every organism has the same glycoconjugates, or things don't work exactly the same way. But what they have in common is they've all got something that falls in this class. So to illustrate that, I want to show you a very simplified illustration of a cell membrane. Now, again, this is extremely simplified, but it just kind of gives you an idea. Now, this is an animal cell in this case, rather than a plant cell, which would have a very different membrane. But you can see the animal cell has two membranes with a kind of layer in the middle. And we're looking at the outer layer, which kind of forms outward from the cell. And what this illustration is showing you is that on the surface of the cell, there are glycoproteins. You can clearly see them labeled. There are glycolipids. You can clearly see them labeled. And there are a lot of other things as well, because the cell membrane is an incredibly complex area. It's not just like this skin of saran wrap or something. It's very complicated and biologically active. And clearly, if this was an actual animal cell instead of a simple illustration, there would be tons of things coating the cell, and they would, very many of them, be different and so on, and they'd be next to each other and things like that. But this gives you a general idea of what I'm talking about and what the glycobiologists are talking about. They're also found not just in the membranes of cells, they're also found inside cells, including the nucleus of cells. And the nucleus, as you may know, is where your genetic material is. So they're kind of all over in your cells. So let's look at some of the functions of these carbs so we can see why they're so important, what they actually do. And we're going to be looking at some major glycan roles. Again, I'd be up here for an entire semester if I was even going to get into you really understanding these functions in any scientific detail. But the good news is you don't have to make good food choices. You don't need to be able to write your own textbook on glycobiology. You just need to illustrate the few simple facts I'm giving you. And these are just some examples of the roles. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list. So one important thing about these glycoconjugates is they're very, very important for the operation of the immune system. And one way your body recognizes itself versus other things that might be dangerous to it, like bacteria or pathogens, parasites, those kind of things, is that it looks at the glycoconjugates that are at the surface of the cell of whatever is invading it, the bacteria or whatever. And from that, your immune system, it helps it make a decision as to, is this something harmless I can just leave alone? Is this actually me and I should leave it alone? Or is this, some strep bacteria that I should be immediately attacking and trying to get in check before it overwhelms me and I'm not surviving anymore? And this is kind of an arms race, and that's why one reason glycobiology is so fascinating, because if you got these pathogens, clearly they don't want to be recognized, because then your immune system would have a better chance of taking care of them. So they're constantly changing these glycoconjugates on the surface of their cell, but your body is changing equally fast, and it sees something new, and it goes, that's very similar to something I saw yesterday, but it's got a little different from one that was actually strep, so I wonder what I should do in this one. So then it changes its own pattern recognition software, and there's this constant arms race between the pathogens and the host of the pathogens, trying to figure out what's dangerous and what's not and how it should react. Another place where glycoconjugates is very important is in fertilization, reproduction, and embryonic development. Successful reproduction is 100% subject to the successful operations of different glycoconjugates operating correctly. The fertilized egg cannot develop into a viable fetus without the operation of these carbohydrate systems. And then just a smattering of some of the other many functions. We've got cell-to-cell signaling and the interaction of cell and its matrix, modulation of the functioning of the genome and of many proteins, proper protein folding. Remember, proteins in your body are useless unless they're properly folded, and they're not going to be properly folded without these carbohydrates units, and the protection of proteins from various enzymes in your body that could destroy them. So again, this is a partial list. It's all very complicated because, for example, the same glycoconjugate could have one function in one part of your body, another function in the other. That's why we've got all these great scientists to try to figure all this out. Now, when I present, one of the things I like to say a lot is it's always the exception that proves the rule. Not always, but frequently the exception proves the rule, or at least makes it very understandable. And this is extremely true of the glycans or carbohydrates in your body. And we can see this through an exception called congenital disorders of glycosylation. These are very serious disorders that are very often fatal, and they're genetic. And what they're caused by is a fertilized egg gets two recessive genes, one from the mother, one from the father, that's coded for an identical congenital disorder of glycosylation, which I'm just going to abbreviate as CDG. Now, fortunately, this is very rare because I said these are very rare diseases that are usually fatal, but they do happen. So, for example, if the fetus only gets one of these genes, but the one from the other parent is okay, it's not going to develop the CDG. So that's why they're so rare. And what they do is they interfere in some way with the formation of various needed glycoproteins. And when this happens, the way it usually happens is that in order to form these glycoproteins, it's a very complex process, and it only proceeds according to certain enzymes at each step. What happens in the CDGs is the body genetically loses the ability to make one of these necessary enzymes. So it can't make the enzyme, therefore the glycoprotein doesn't form, therefore this essential function never gets carried out. So CDGs have many symptoms. Just a few of them include abnormalities in fat distribution and blood clotting and immune system functioning, formation of the cerebellum, which is an integral part of the brain, liver or heart disease, and seizures, and then there's a long list of others. So, as I said, usually if a fertilized egg is affected by this, there's really no way to treat it. There's no successful birth. In the rare case where a fetus will survive to birth, it usually, unfortunately, doesn't survive long afterward. There's really no good treatment for any of these diseases. There's a couple that can be somewhat treated, although not really that satisfactorily, but most of them can't be treated at all at this point. They're very rare diseases, as I said, but they're the exceptions that prove the rule and show to anybody. If you say to one of your friends, I went to a presentation today and I learned that carbohydrates are essential for the function of your body, and your friend laughs so hard they fall down on the floor, and then they finally pick themselves up after 10 minutes, you can tell them about the CDGs to show that you know what you're talking about. So are there essential glycans? Are there certain carbohydrates you have to eat? Well, the answer turns out to be no, that your body is a carbohydrate factory, that as long as you're eating these basic sugars, it can form the glycoconjugates that it needs. And one important thing is your body can and does make sugars from protein, but it can't make sugars from fat. So if all you're really eating is fat, it's going to be hard to get the basic sugars that you need for your body to operate. If you're mostly eating protein, that's not a good thing for a zillion other reasons, but at least your body will be able to make glycans by converting the protein to sugars, which, as I said, is a process that it does all the time. So just as this quote illustrates, it says humans, this is again from another paraglycobiologist, humans, with the exception of certain rare CDG patients, biosynthesize the different monosaccharides the body needs from common dietary precursors. So if you go home and you just have something simple and healthy, such as a bowl of brown rice or a baked potato or something, you can feel good you're getting what you need. You don't have to worry about essential amino acids or essential fatty acids, as we'll see in a minute. So one thing that I can't pass up before we go, and I'm only going to spend a second on this, is lectins. Now, you're probably aware that there's at least one doctor out there, and there's probably more of them by now, who are out there telling you, oh God, don't eat lectins, they'll kill you. Well, what are lectins? Most people don't even know what lectins are, other than they've read somewhere that some doctor says they'll kill you, so you just have to eat as supplements and nothing else. So lectins are one of two classes of protein that most frequently bind to carbohydrates or glycans. Now remember, we talked about these glycoconjugates, which are partly carbohydrates and partly, in some cases, protein. Well, we talked about the carbohydrates, we didn't talk about the protein. Well, not every protein is going to bind to every carbohydrate, but one of the classes of proteins that these carbs bind to most frequently and going about doing their essential jobs in the body are called lectins. So lectins are a class of proteins. They're a very, very large class of proteins. And they're in almost all foods. They're not just in beans. They're not just in plants. They're also in microorganisms. They're also in animals. So if you're going to eat a lectin-free diet and just eat whatever this guy's selling you for however much he charges to sell it to you, and you just decide to go out and eat on your own, and you try to eat a lectin-free diet, you're probably going to starve to death because you're not going to find any lectin-free foods. It's very misleading. So that said, let's go on to the last of the dangerous misconceptions I'm going to talk about today, which has to do with fatty acids, and I'm going to talk about the specific misconception: your body benefits from lots of omega-3 fatty acids, especially long-chain omega-3s. Now, if you haven't already heard that 5 times today, you probably haven't been online, because it's one of the most common, frequent dietary messages you're going to see from any nutrition person, no matter what they're telling you to eat. I don't care if they're giving you the keto diet or the paleo diet or a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet or some other diet, they're all going to be telling you to eat omega-3. So it's one of the things they all have in common. So of course, I can't let that go by without giving you some facts about it. So for this, we have to go into our third science, which is a science called lipidomics, which is the study of lipids, which is a kind of class of chemicals that don't dissolve in water that fats belong to. So fats are kind of lipid, but there's lipids that aren't fats. But in terms of when you're thinking about what you're eating, you're probably thinking about fats. So I'm just going to concentrate on them and not on the other kind of lipids out there. So again, to read from a scientist in lipidomics, he says, lipids play many essential roles in cellular functions, including cellular barriers, membrane matrices, signaling, and energy depots. Cellular lipids are highly complex, that is, there are tens to hundreds of thousands of molecular species. Cellular lipids are also highly dynamic, that is, they're constantly changing with physiological, pathological, and environmental conditions. So the thing about fats, or you can think of them as fatty acids in food, I'm just going to use those terms interchangeably, is that those are also chains. So we've been talking a lot about chains here, but the fatty acid chains are basically chains of carbon atoms. So you've probably all heard of carbons, and when you put them all together in a big long chain and then you attach some hydrogens, you've got a fatty acid. And again, their functions include energy storage, we all know that, as well as cell membrane functioning and synthesis of other important subjects. Now, as well as carbs bind to other substances, the lipids also do. For example, lipids combine to proteins, and then you get the lipoproteins, which include, for example, cholesterol. But again, I'm not really talking about them today. So in terms of actually what you need to eat in terms of fat, remember we talked about your body's basically a protein factory, but it needs these 8 essential amino acids that can make the others, and from them it can assemble every protein you need. It's a carb manufacturing plant because it can make all the carbs you need without any precursors other than either protein or carbohydrates. It can make the tens of thousands of millions of kinds you need. And in fats, it can make every single kind you need, so you don't have to worry about essential fats, with 2 exceptions, which I'm positive everybody in this room has heard of, which are the omega-3s and the omega-6s. And in terms of those, they only need very specific omega-3s and omega-6s, which I'll review in a minute. But the thing about understanding why this is so important is understanding carbon, because remember the chain is made of carbon. So what is carbon? Carbon is a kind of chemical or an element that has to have 4 bonds. That's one thing about carbon. It has to have 4 chemical bonds. So if you pretend you're a carbon atom, and I'm going to pretend I'm a carbon atom, and each of your bonds, let's think of it as an arm, and it has a handle on the end. And the basic principle you have to remember is that every hand at the end of every arm has to be holding on to something. That's a basic law of nature, is every arm on this carbohydrate atom has to be holding hands with somebody or something. So if I'm a carbohydrate atom, I have my left hand and right hand, just like all the rest of you. But I also have an arm growing out of my chest with a hand on the end, and I have an arm growing out of my back with a hand on the end, and now I'm a carbon atom. But every single one of those hands at the end of the arm has to be holding on to something. Well, when is it happy? Well, the arms are happy, or they're happiest in terms of fats, when they're holding on to a hydrogen atom. So you've got your carbon arm, it's holding on to a hydrogen. This is called a saturated fat, because every carbon is holding on, every arm of every carbon is holding on either to the carbon next to it, hello, Mr. Carbon there and Mr. Carbon there, as well as to the hydrogens in front and back of it. Okay, so the carbon couldn't possibly be happier. When it's in the state, it's in a very low energy state, it's very happy, and it's going to take a huge amount of work to get it to do anything else, because this is its sweet spot. This is exactly where it wants to be. So this is a very chemically stable fat. Now, what you get, I talked about the saturated fats, that's the ones where everybody's holding onto a carbon, is or is holding onto another carbon or to a hydrogen. If the hydrogens start going missing, which is a catastrophe as far as the carbons are concerned, you then have a polyunsaturated fat, or you have a monounsaturated fat if just 2 next to each other go missing. And I'm going to show you how this works. So, oh, sorry, I kind of missed going to that one. Okay, sorry, I was talking about the last slide. I didn't go to it, but it doesn't matter. So this is the one that really matters. I was trying to find for the longest time a good model of an unsaturated fat, and I could never find anything, so I decided to build my own out of a Tinker Toy set. And it turned out unexpectedly good. Hopefully you guys know what Tinker Toys are. So in this simple model, every yellow little circle in the middle is a carbon in a chain. The little red circles at the end are the special units that are at the end of every fat chain, which we don't have to worry about. And the blues are hydrogens, okay? So you can see in my vastly oversimplified chain that most of the carbons are holding on to two hydrogens as well as the carbon next to it or the unit at the end next to it. So they're all perfectly happy, and it's going to be really hard to get them to go anywhere or anything terrible to happen to it. But the two in the middle have each lost a carbon. So what are they going to do? Have each lost a hydrogen. So what are they going to do? So you can see they each have one hydrogen, but their second hydrogen they're lacking, which means they've got one arm kind of dangling out there that's doing nothing. And it's very unhappy. And remember, so what's it going to do? It's going to hold hands with the carbon that's next to it. So my friend, Mr. Carbon over here, has also lost a hydrogen, and I've lost a hydrogen. So what are we going to do? We're going to kind of reach across, and we're going to hold hands with each other. Because remember, every carbon hand has to be holding another hand. Well, what happens? You can even see it in this simplified Tinker Toy model. You don't need a PhD in biochemistry. You can see it on the Tinker Toy. Where the carbons are reaching across to each other, they form a bend. And you can see they're kind of stretching and straining, and the chain is all bent. And that's, by the way, why polyunsaturated fats are liquid. It's because they can't get close to each other because they're all bent out of shape, literally. And so they're very unstable there. It doesn't take much to destabilize this kind of bent bond. And one thing that can destabilize it is oxygen. So oxygen comes in and it can form very dangerous free radicals when it attacks these double bonds. So now we're ready to get into the essential fatty acids, and we can run through this pretty quick. So there's two kinds of essential fatty acids. Both have 18 carbons in their chain, with the first double bond specifically placed. Again, higher animals can't make them. Plants and insects can. They're very energy intensive to make, as you can judge by what I just told you. So what's essential is simply that your body can't make them, so they have to come from food. So you've got the omega-6 fatty acid, which is called linoleic acid, and you have the omega-3 fatty acid called linolenic acid. So let's look at the double bonds. So all these different kinds of fatty acids, the polyunsaturated ones, are liquid at room temperature because of the double bonds. The omega-6, the 18-chain essential omega-6, has two double bonds. The 18-chain omega-3 fatty acid has three double bonds. Now, your body is going to want some of these essential fatty acids that are going to be longer than having 18 carbons in them. They're going to want to add 2 to 4 carbons. So they have a special enzyme that can do that, and we all have that enzyme. So let's see what happens. Again, your body can make these longer chains. So you only need to eat the 18-chain ones. You don't need to eat the ones that are have 20 carbons in the chain, and you don't need to eat the ones that have 22 carbons in the chain. So what are those called? Again, you've probably all heard of these because somebody's probably tried to sell you these for a lot of money. In terms of the omega-3s, you have EPA, which has 20 carbons and 5 double bonds, and DHA, which has 22 carbons and fully 6 double bonds. Let me repeat that, it's 6 double bonds. The likelihood that one of those is going to break, be oxidized, form dangerous free radicals is probably close to 100%. And that's also called, by the way, in terms of fats, is called becoming rancid. So if it's not rancid when you eat it, it's almost certainly going to become rancid after you eat it. In terms of the omega-6, the one that's best known is AA, arachidonic acid, that has 20 carbons and 4 double bonds. So all these essential fats, they're not essential in terms of eating it, but they're essential in terms of your body making it, are very dangerous because they have so many double bonds and highly susceptible to oxidation. Now, your body doesn't want a lot of these spare chemicals on you. Remember, they become oxidized very quickly. When they become oxidized, they're very dangerous. Your body has very little way of protecting you against them. It can form antioxidants, but again, these things are so easy to attack by oxygen, which, by the way, you hopefully have a lot of oxygen in your body, and if you don't, you're probably dead. So, the oxygen in your body is going to attack these things too. So why does your body have these very dangerous fatty acids? Well, they have some very, very specific and limited functions. In terms of DHA, remember that's the one that has the 22 carbons and the 6 double bonds. It's necessary for the maturation functioning of the eye and the brain and nervous system in fetal life and in early infancy. And then the arachidonic acid and EPA are essential for making certain hormonal-like substance that you need in limited amounts and your body makes when you need it. So, given they do have these essential functions, you might see why people might misunderstand it and think, my God, I haven't taken my fish oil capsule today, or I haven't taken my algae oil capsule today, or I didn't eat my pound of salmon this week, therefore I'm going to become stupid and develop dementia and die 10 years early. Well, that's not how it works. The thing about the deposition of DHA in the brain is that it peaks during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy and the 1st year of infancy. So if you're already an adult, it's kind of too late. And you might wonder, well, gee, my mom was pregnant before she knew about all these omega-3s, so she never took algae oil or fish oil, so there must be something wrong with my brain. Well, that's not how it works. That's not how humans survived 4 billion years of evolution. The way it works is that, remember I told you there's an enzyme that your body produces and that forms these fatty acids that are very dangerous to form. And your body makes these enzymes only in very limited amounts because it doesn't want to form any excess because they're so dangerous. But pregnant women have a body that's smart enough to make lots of extra of this enzyme because the pregnant woman knows, whether she knows it consciously or not, but her body knows that her developing fetus needs these extra polyunsaturated fatty acids. So she produces more of this enzyme. Therefore, without her eating anything different from what she ate before, she's going to make a lot more than she did before. So the body forms these extra fatty acids, it puts it on a little train, it transports it right across the placenta directly to the fetus, and then the fetus has it. Your body has some ongoing need for these longer chain omega-3s and omega-6s after birth, but it's very low. So let's look at some quotes that have to do with deficiency. I'm going to read a series of these. These are written by scientists in the field. Most diets in the United States and Canada meet the minimum essential fatty acid requirement adequately. Historically, deficiencies have developed only in infants and young children who've been fed fat-free milk and low-fat diets, or in hospital clients who've been mistakenly fed formulas that provide no polyunsaturated fatty acids for long periods of time. Next one, what about people who don't eat fish? People who do not eat fish or fish products and therefore apparently have limited opportunities to ingest EPA and DHA do not appear to exhibit the symptoms of omega-3 deficiency. Overt omega-3 deficiency is a rare and extreme condition. So why is this true? I already kind of told you, but let's reiterate it. Dietary DHA is not necessarily essential throughout life. It appears that DHA turns over very slowly. Metabolic demands for DHA appear to be very low, especially once tissue pools are sufficient. Indeed, existing metabolic levels of DHA, remember this is the longest chain one that is in the brain, probably represent what is appropriate for normal healthy metabolism. If DHA is not found to be synthesized to any significant degree in the studies conducted so far, perhaps this is because it's not required in significant amounts for the general population's healthy metabolism, and it's produced only when required. I hope all you guys write this down or remember it, because this is true for most things. Your body kind of knows what's going on way more than any scientist who's trying to sell you a book or a lot of supplements or get a published paper in some journal so he can get tenure or something like that. Your body is a product of 4 billion years of evolution, kind of knows what's going on in this stuff. And if your body says, this is the amount I need and this is the amount I produce, and if you give me more, it's toxic excess, I would believe my body over the guy trying to sell you the $50 supplements. But maybe that's just me. In terms of research on omega-3s, there's recent large studies, for example, cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of alleged benefits of taking a lot of omega-3s out there, and on some of them many years ago, decades ago, in early studies that were very small and not well done, have found some small effects. But actually, more recent studies have found that, for example, for cardiovascular disease, which is the most touted thing, that fish oil supplements do not reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease negative outcomes. And again, recent studies have pretty uniformly found there's no cardiovascular benefit to taking a bunch of fish oil supplementation. How about the dangers? Remember, I talked about toxic excess. Well, in terms of fish and fish oil, some of the well-proven dangers include persistent organic pollutants that are found in fish oil supplements, even if they're labeled as purified. High DHA levels can lower arachidonic acid levels in pregnancy, thus impairing fetal growth. And high EPA and DHA levels are associated with high-grade prostate tumor risk. That's been very well demonstrated, that the kind of really bad kind of prostate cancer, the kind that kills you quickly and not maybe hurt you over 5 decades, but probably won't, is associated with taking too much omega-3s. Other DHA side effects include nausea, diarrhea, suppressed immune function, and prolonged bleeding. So let's come into the summary now. In terms of the question we started with, which is which macronutrient is the most important? Most people would say proteins are the most important, and by most people I mean people who are online or just kind of parroting what they've read online. Or is it carbohydrates or is it fat? Which helps most in the structure and functioning of your body? Well, hopefully by now you've concluded this is a completely ridiculous, meaningless question. It's like saying, which is more important, your heart or your liver? Which is more important, your kidney or your bones? Or your skin or, the functioning of your immune system? It's just a ridiculous question. Everything works together. Everything reinforces everything else in a good way or in a bad way if you're taking the wrong kind or too much of it. They bind together. They work together. Their only interest is maintaining your homeostasis, keeping you alive, and helping you reproduce, because that's the aim of evolution. And then how do we summarize that even more? Well, there we get to my single favorite quotation, other than one I read to you before about your body's actually producing what it needs. And this is from the book called Whole by Dr. T. Colin Campbell. So I'm going to read you this quote, and this is not my quote. This is a quote from Dr. Campbell in his book Whole, which is a groundbreaking book I recommend very highly. He says, when I lecture publicly, I'm often asked about the numbers. Many people want precise formulas and rules. If you're asking those questions right now, here's my answer. Relax. Eating the whole food plant-based way eliminates the need to worry about the details. Just eat lots of different plant foods. Your body will do the math for you. That's my single favorite sentence in all of nutrition, is your body will do the math for you. So you don't have to worry about all these macronutrients. You don't need to spend a fortune on very expensive and probably harmful omega-3 supplements or protein powders or anything. Just eat a whole bunch of different kind of whole foods. That would include, for example, fruits, veggies, nuts, seeds, beans, lentils, and whole grains of various kinds. Those would be all kinds of whole foods. And from those, you can make a zillion different recipes. You can find tons and tons and tons of them online. There's also tons of cookbooks out, and there's just all kinds of information on how to do this. But, this diet doesn't get boring. You can make soups and salads and rice dishes and pasta dishes and every ethnicity known to humankind out of it, and even healthy desserts and smoothies. So, you're not going to get bored eating this way. And this is actually just another way of restating the principle of homeostasis I told you before, which is that since all your cells have implicit in them these 4 billion years of evolution, and they know how to maintain homeostasis by you giving them a wide variety of inputs, but not too much of anything, then they're going to be able to take what they need and maintain your healthy balance. So I've had a pretty ambitious goal today, which is to change how you think of your body, that it's marvelous, that it's intricate, and that paradoxically you don't have to worry about it nearly as much as you were thinking you did. So that's the end of the 3 misconceptions I'm going to talk about, and I'm happy to answer nutrition-related questions. Yes?
I read a lot about soaking grains and soaking beans, like grains with cider vinegar. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, first off, soaking grains is something fairly new. When our ancestors were roaming the savannas of Africa, they weren't soaking their grains. They were eating whatever food they could find to give them enough calories to keep them alive. So your digestive system is made for whatever your ancestors could put in it to get enough calories not to starve to death. That said, I personally have nothing against soaking grains. If you like it better that way, if you find it easier to digest that way, that's certainly fine, but I don't see a necessity to do it. But it's the whole plant food, so if you want to soak your grains, do it. Any other questions? Yes?
Yes, I really, before I came to this, to your talk, I watched a talk you gave about 9 years ago.
Oh, cool!
On YouTube. And so my question is, I vaguely recall that for somebody who is vegan, you did say that there was one vitamin, I don't know if it's the B12 or D12 that you were recommending to take as a supplement. Do you still stand by that?
Yes, and thank you for bringing it up. Most vitamins are made by plants, period. There's one vitamin that's not made by plants, and that's B12. They're actually made by bacteria. And again, when our ancestors were out on the savannas of Africa, and then later on they spread to the mountains of Europe and the plains of Asia, and then everywhere else they migrated to, they were eating food off the ground, right? They were eating what they could find, and the food had B12 in it because it had all been bacterially contaminated, and they were drinking from lakes and streams or rivers or wherever. So again, lots of B12. Well, nowadays we sanitize everything. We don't get that much B12 unless we contaminated food, which I don't recommend to anybody living on a planet with 8 billion people and plenty of toxic waste. So the best way to get your B12 is with supplements. They're safe, they're very inexpensive. So that would be my recommendation. In terms of vitamin D, which I also thank you for raising, that's actually not a vitamin at all. It's a hormone because your body can make it when your skin is exposed to sun. If for some reason you cannot get out in the sun, maybe you've had skin cancer and your doctor told you never go in the sun, or for something like that, you can take vitamin D supplements as well. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes?
I was just wondering about, I have a lot of food sensitivities and allergies and stuff, especially to like nuts and things that would give a lot of protein. And I find that when I eat lots of protein, it seems like it keeps my blood sugar more, solid than if I'm eating mostly carbohydrates. Could you address either of those things?
Well, remember, all whole foods have everything in them. So whether you're looking at, a banana or a nut or a whole grain, and by the way, whole grains are nothing but seeds. So if you can't tolerate, seeds like, for example, sunflower seeds or something, I know which ones you can't tolerate. But if you're eating whole grains are also seeds. That's what they are. Or beans or lentils, which are also seeds. Or, whatever it is you're eating, they all have carbohydrates in them. They all have some fats in them, and they all have some proteins in them, but they can be in different amounts. In terms of people saying, I'm sensitive to this or that food, certainly food allergies are a real thing, especially these days when food is so highly processed. And so you very well could have food allergies, or sensitivities. You would know that better than I would, and you might want to work with your doctor on that, but you're not going to be deficient in protein or any of the other macronutrients. I think you need to put together some program that makes sense for you, given your kinds of food you like and what you prefer to cook and what your sensitivities are. You might want to work with a physician on that or some other healthcare professional. Yes?
You Too much of a good thing is still too much. So, I've heard people eat, too much soy or certain vegetable. Does that apply to even green leafy things, or everything? Does that apply to?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. The question was, I'm not sure everybody could hear it, is too much of anything can be too much. Like even too much of a good food. Like soy is a good food, but you can eat too much. Green leafies are a good food, but you can eat too much. That is very true. That's why you want to eat a wide variety of whole foods. You don't want to just live on kale and tofu. You want to eat a big, wide variety of things. That's not to say you can't have one meal that's nothing but greens cooked with tofu. You certainly can. You could even have 2 or 3 meals in a row like that. But you want to diversify your food because that's going to give you the best balance, and not think green leafies are good for me, so I'm going to eat 20 pounds of kale a day. That's not a smart thing to do. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just curious to know your thoughts on population, and let's say the Inuits, who don't really have access to carbohydrate, and their main diet is animals and fat and protein. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the thing about the Inuits is the data most people have heard about them is wrong. What happened with the Inuits, where the wrong data got out initially, is a couple scientists went up to, I believe it was Greenland, and the village they went to had a Western-type physician in it, but he was several days' journey from the Inuit village. So these 2 scientists went up there, and they never visited the Inuit. They just talked to the doctor, and they said to the doctor, what do people die of around here? And he said, well, the Inuit sure don't die of heart attacks. Well, of course they don't. They were like 2 or 3 days' journey from the village, so they'd all be dead of a heart attack before they got there, so their families didn't bother to bring them in. They just died of a heart attack in their village, and they got buried or whatever the funeral rites were, and this doctor never knew what had happened. So that got written up, and that got spread as kind of an urban myth for probably decades. And since then, there's been a lot of detailed studies, most particularly on frozen bodies, that people who were Inuit got frozen in the ice, and sometimes these bodies have been exhumed like centuries later, where, this was pre-European contact for the Inuit. And they all had clogged arteries. So this whole idea that Inuit don't have clogged arteries because they eat all these omega-3s is a complete myth, and it's based on highly flawed science.
Well, I'm not clear. How do you explain that the Inuit population survived since the beginning of times?
Well, remember, they were eating mostly animals, and the animals had not just fat, but also protein, and your body can form and does form carbohydrates out of protein. So let's say they were eating a fatty seal. Okay, the fat on the seal could not be turned into anything else because your body can't turn fat into anything but fat. But the protein in the seal could either be used as protein or it could be made into carbohydrates, and that's where they got the carbohydrates in addition to whatever limited plant foods they were able to eat. So they did manage to survive. It was a very hard survival. They had a short lifespan. They were not healthy, but in fact, they were able to maintain a survivable population. But it's not how I would recommend that anybody in modern day world choose to live.
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to believe that 200,000 years ago, depending on where you were on the Earth, access to carbohydrate could be very limited. And it wouldn't really be at all like the carbohydrates or the vegetables and fruit that we find today. Would you?
Well, there's different animals that have different capabilities. Remember, there's not just humans. In terms of our ancestors, we evolved on the savannas of Africa. What are savannas? They're huge fields of grass. What are grass seeds? Today we call grass seeds whole grains. So they were out there with these millions of acres of savanna that were just full of whole grains, and that's a lot of what they were eating. And in fact, recent paleontological studies show that. Those are the people that spread to Africa, started in Africa, spread to Europe and Asia and to the Americas and so on, and are our ancestors. In terms of other, hominids or other species of animals, might have had a different metabolism. I can't really speak to them. I'm just speaking to humans.
What about the Ice Age?
Well, again, people had different diets in different places. Some people lived, some villages died out. Yes?
Your lecture got me to thinking about what the definition of life is, and there's philosophically and scientifically, it's a big question that we still linger out there.
Right.
Your lecture got me to thinking that life could be defined as something that has glycogens and essential fatty acids. What would you say to that?
Well, according to the glycobiologists, all the life they've studied for over 3 billion years has had glycoconjugates on the surface. In terms of what life had before that time, the origins of life or life on other planets or whatever, I can't really speak to that. But in terms of life as we know it now, yeah, we've got the various kingdoms and there are certain essentials to life, but in terms of what those are, I'm not a PhD in biology, so I don't want to try to give you an exhaustive list.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much for coming. And I want to thank Dr. Stanger. She's amazing. She's been kind and supportive of Even for as long as I can remember. And if you want to visit our table out there, you can pick up whatever literature you want. Thank you, Janice.
Oh, thank you, and Even does a great job. I love Even, and I love you.
I love you too. Here's a small thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, look how cute that is. Thank you. Oh, that's adorable. I love it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all for coming.